Hello.
How's it going?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Just getting
It's
ready for the new semester and everything.
cool. I'm just turning my phone off here real quick. What are you teaching this semester?
My normal teaching load is kind of like our XPhys one class, and then teach like our strength conditioning two class is the easiest way to kind of. It's got a weird name, but it's essentially strength conditioning two.
Oh, okay. Nice. And remind me where you're at again?
So I'm at the University of South Alabama.
South Alabama. Okay, I knew it was somewhere down there.
Yeah, so
Very cool.
we're in Mobile, kind of like right by the bay, which is pretty
Oh,
nice.
okay. You're sweating your nutsack off down there.
It's it's not too bad. It's been hotter than like. Granted, this is my second summer here,
Okay.
but it's hotter than last summer. But I grew up in Palm Springs,
Oh,
and
so you're used to it.
yeah, so nothing out here like even touches Palm Springs, in my opinion.
Nice.
When you're talking about an average day is like 125.
Oh, eef.
It's yeah, I'm not worried about 95.
Oh,
I don't care if it is 80% humidity. I'm not worried about 95.
oh. Yeah, it's we had a few days and it's supposed to get hot again this weekend here, but it was in the 90s. The humidity was like, 75%, 80%. And oh, I don't know. You go outside and you just sweat everywhere, but you get more used to it. I usually get in spring is usually the worst because we'll have obviously it's very cold here in the winter. And then all of a sudden you'll be like warmer, warmer, and you'll get those couple days where it spikes up really high and you're like, oh, I wasn't not used to this, but it's not as bad now.
Where are you again?
I'm in Minnesota.
Oh, okay, nice.
Yeah.
My mom's husband has a lot of family up in Minnesota,
Oh, okay. Oh, very
up
nice.
around Duluth and such.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I did my undergrad in Duluth there, so very
Oh,
nice.
nice.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to just basically chat about. I know you've done a bunch of stuff on intermittent fasting, and yeah, just kind of maybe start there and kind of wherever it goes.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. And you're good for an hour, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty flexible today since essentially it's just we don't have any meetings or anything. It's just, class prep and stuff like that.
Okay. So if we go a few minutes over, you're okay. I think it should be right around an hour or so. Okay.
Yeah, it's completely fine.
Cool. Yeah, and I do a little intro, outro after this. So yeah, so I'll just do a short pause and away we go.
Great.
Welcome back to Flex Diet Podcast. And today we're going to talk a little bit about some intermittent fasting and some other great topics. So, how are you today, Doc?
Doing great. Yourself?
Doing good. Good. It was nice to see you again at the ISSN meeting. Thank you very much for your talk that you gave there. I thought that was, yeah, it was really good.
Yeah, it's always a fun time. That's always a one that I try to hit up every year.
Yeah. And I guess kind of the main topic today we're talking about is intermittent fasting. I know you've published some research, I know, on this related to some performance metrics and body comp. And I guess to start off, like how did you get interested in that line of research?
So it's kind of especially with intermittent fasting specifically, it's kind of a roundabout way where I got really interested in research during actually I was in undergrad at the time, but I actually wasn't an exercise science major yet. I had a bunch of jobs in the fitness industry. I was a personal trainer for a couple of years, and then I worked at a supplement store for a couple of years. And then when I kind of decided I wasn't really into what I initially was studying in college, which was music performance anymore,
Hmm.
I
It's a little bit of
uh,
a hard turn.
yeah,
Music
it's just a,
performance to exercise physiology.
that's always a funny one to people, and there's kind of even a longer roundabout way about how that kind of came out. But I was a semi-professional musician for a long time, but like as a lot of musicians can tell you, it can be kind of hard to pay the bills occasionally with that, especially in
Yeah.
classical music, which was my focus. And so
What did you
um,
play?
I was a trumpet player, and
Oh, okay.
so
Nice.
yeah, I did that for a long time. Played in some good orchestras. Got to travel across Europe and stuff for it. It was pretty cool.
Nice.
But when I started to get kind of burned out on that lifestyle, since a lot of the side jobs that I used to also kind of supplement the income were all in the fitness industry, started thinking like, what could I do? And so then I switched over to exercise science because that kind of was up my alley. But while I was a personal trainer and working at a supplement store and stuff, I always tried to dive into the research a bunch to, basically make sure that I could help either my clients or customers and stuff like that as much as possible. And so once I got into the actual field and got an opportunity to start helping out with some research it was at the University of New Mexico under Dr. Van Dusseldorp, who she was a
Oh,
doc student. Yeah, she was a doc student at the time
oh, I
there
didn't
while I
know that.
was, yeah. So,
Wow,
and
small world.
yeah, very, very, very small.
Shout out to Trisha.
And yeah, so Trish was a doc student at the time, and I ended up being one of the first participants in her dissertation, and then ended up helping out with it a bit on the research team, which really kind of solidified that I really liked the research route, and I really wanted to continue going down that for a living. And then when she graduated from New Mexico, she got hired over at Kennesaw State. And
Mm-hmm.
then, so then when I was getting ready to graduate about a year later, she called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to come do your master's over here?" And so I said, sure. And so I packed up everything and moved across the country from New Mexico all the way to Kennesaw, a little bit outside of Atlanta. And and her research and a lot of my interests had always been kind of around the nutrition supplement side, and so that's a lot of the stuff that we were doing. But with that, I had, especially before I got into the major, I had dabbled a lot in like the specialty diets, trying them on myself or trying to read on much, including intermittent fasting and like keto, all that kind of stuff. And intermittent fasting was the one that always kind of I gravitated to the most, I guess you could say,
Mm-hmm.
because one of the things that I kind of liked about it is to me, it seemed to have kind of the best utility for most people. And what I mean by that is most of the specialty diets out there that you see, it's always like avoid this macronutrient or cut all of these out or have to do all this kind of counting and stuff like that. And for what intermittent fasting was kind of basically just saying like, hey, still just continue to do your daily life, just only try to eat between this time and this time. Like we're not telling you what to eat or how to eat. We're just saying like, hey, just try to fit your meals between these two times. And then outside of that, you do you. And that seemed like a very flexible way that kind of like helped gravitated to working into most people's daily life. And then when I was getting ready to do my thesis for my master's, we had this kind of intermittent fasting study that had been on the table for a bit that my current advisor at the time, Trisha, and my future doctoral advisor, Grant Tinsley, had been kind of talking about. And so I ended up kind of taking that over, messing with it a little bit to kind of fit my interests because I kind of looked around and said, at the time, there were about 3 studies using resistance training, which is, the modality of exercise that I prefer to study, and intermittent fasting, but I didn't really think any of them actually kind of hit the mark on what a lot of people are using intermittent fasting for. For instance, the one big one, the Morrow 2016 paper at the time that a lot of people still like to cite, that one was it was a really good study, but it was looking at intermittent fasting when people trying to either stay the same weight or slightly gain weight. And I've never met anybody that says, I want to gain weight. What am I going to do? Stop eating. I've never seen that. And then both in the Tinsley 2017, the Tinsley 2019 paper were kind of similar, where the 2017 paper, there wasn't that much kind of dietary control. It was more of like, we asked these people to start eating like this. How do they change their behavior? What happens? How do they change their intake? Which is great information, but it doesn't really answer the question, does fasting do anything? And then same thing with the 2019. They were looking at more trying to say like body recomposition, as opposed to where most people are trying to say like lose weight when they go and utilize this. So I decided to run kind of the first study at the time where people ate the same amount of food and trying to get them to lose weight and lift it and saw what happened. And then Grant was on the committee for that. So on my thesis committee. And then during that, he called me up and said, "Hey, we're starting a doc program over here at Texas Tech. Do you want to come over here and be my doc student?" And since he was one of the few people doing intermittent fasting research at the time, and I really wanted to continue doing intermittent fasting, packed up everything and moved to scenic Lubbock, Texas, which that sentence has never been said in earnest.
Yeah, I've been there once and I was like, interesting.
That's a very good way to describe it. Great place to do grad school because there's not anything to distract you from grad
not
school.
a lot of distractions. There's that one bar in the corner, and I think that's about it.
Pretty much. You got Texas Tech, and then that's pretty much Lubbock. But so then spent 3 years out there kind of immersing in everything regarding fasting and body composition assessment, and continued doing some supplement work. And then for my dissertation, I got really kind of interested as well in how things like breakfast could potentially affect training and such, because the number one meal that most intermittent fasting protocols will tell you to get rid of is breakfast. Like the vast majority of it is just skip breakfast, kind of eat later in the day and see what happens. And so we basically looked at, how does eating breakfast affect your performance later in the day after you start eating, for those that maybe skip breakfast but still train in the afternoon, kind of that crowded gym time that anyone's ever been to, an after-work gym crowd knows that's the vast majority. So how might intermittent fasting protocols affect something like that? And so we've got that kind of under review, and then that kind of leads us to today, I guess.
Very cool. And we should probably back up and give a definition of intermittent fasting. So the two-part question is, what is your definition of intermittent fasting? And then I think most of the studies you were referring to were using kind of a 16-8 protocol, correct?
Yeah, so it's a very, very good point that we always need to kind of define this. And so what intermittent fasting actually is, despite what a lot of people think, it's a very blanket term. And so it encompasses a really broad spectrum of protocols, everything from ADF, or what's known as alternate day fasting, where you will have someone typically eat one day, eat kind of normally, and then don't eat the next day, and then just do that every other day, so on and so forth in perpetuity. Or what's sometimes called periodic fasting, where it can be anything from a 24-hour fast once or twice a week to some of these slightly more extended fasts, like say 48, 72 hours. When you get to 72 hours, that's when we might start classifying it outside of intermittent fasting and closer to what we call extended fasting. But popular protocols, say something like Eat Stop Eat is a very popular protocol, which is that 24 hours once or twice a week, where the nice thing is you still get to eat every single day, even though there's the 24-hour fast in there, which something like alternate day fasting might not allow. But the one that most people think of when you say intermittent fasting is one that we in the literature like to term time-restricted eating. It used to be kind of termed time-restricted feeding, so TRF. More recently, there's been kind of a push to move from TRF to TRE, or time-restricted eating. But that's going to be those kind of shorter daily fasts. And when I say shorter, most people might think a 16-hour fast or an 18-hour, 20-hour fast doesn't sound like a very short fast, but it's short in comparison to these 24, 36, 48-hour fasts that some of the other protocols are. But some 16 and 8 is going to be the most common one that you kind of see out there, which is 16 hours of fasting versus 8 hours of feeding. So an example of that would be eating every single day, but only between noon and 8 p.m. So basically skip breakfast, have lunch, maybe have a mid-afternoon snack, have dinner, and then kind of carry around your day. The next most common one, and that I should say that's going to be the version that's in a lot of the more recent studies, as well as say the Morrow study that I mentioned earlier, the Tinsley 2019 paper study, my studies, those are all using that kind of 16 and 8 protocol. The other really common one you might see occasionally is what's called the 20 and 4 protocol, where fast for 20 hours a day, then eat for 4 hours a day. So might eat between like 4 and 8 p.m. or something like that. That one's a little rare, but I do come across that one in the field quite a bit as
I
well.
think that was originally kind of off of the Ori Hofmeckler stuff from the Warrior Diet, I think, wasn't it? He was kind of the
Yep.
first person I ever heard like kind of talk about fasting, and then Brad Pilon was kind of the second guy I heard kind of more popularize it.
Yeah, Ori Hofmeckler's book, Warrior Diet, which is interesting. Like he actually, for the most throughout most of the book, doesn't actually advocate that much for a 20 and 4,
Not
but
really,
that's
but that seems to be what is
but that's
associated.
where
And obviously, he kind of
yeah,
popularized it from there.
yeah, that's where he, for instance, he talks about during a lot of it eating more of just straight protein as opposed to straight fasting. But yeah, the warrior diet is typically accredited to Ori Hofmeckler's 20 and 4, just like the 16 and 8, which for a long time was kind of termed the lean gains diet,
Yeah,
because
Martin.
Martin Bergkamp from Lean Gains was one of the first people to popularize that. Then it got really popular when a book from Men's Health came out called The 8 Hour Diet, which basically copied most of his
It's almost
writings.
identical.
Yeah, I think he literally just went to the Lean Gains website and just like copy pasted.
Yeah.
And
Have you
then
ever
yeah,
met Martin in person?
I have not personally.
I
No.
haven't either. I've heard he's quite the character.
That's what I've heard. Everyone I've talked to that has met him said he's quite the character. Yeah. And then Brad Pilon's Eat Stop Eat is the most common like whole day fasting, which for a long time it was called whole day fasting. Now we've kind of moved to categorizing it under that periodic fasting. But I'd say those are the most common. And I think that's also a great example of one of those times where we see stuff start to get really popular out in the field. And then a lot of us researchers kind of start latching on to it and go, okay, this is really popular. Let's start seeing if it actually does anything. And then it kind of like balloons into this whole field to this now point that, in the research world, especially if you're looking at reviews, like intermittent fasting is one of the most popular thing to find a review on, to the point that we have, I think, close to 3 times as many reviews as we have actual studies now.
Yeah, that's my pet peeve with that. And not that there's not a good place for reviews, and I love a good review, whether it's meta-analysis, narrative review, whatever. It's a great kind of one-stop shopping, jumping off point, especially if you're new in an area. But it seemed like, especially when COVID kind of halted a lot of original research because labs are just physically shut down, the amount of reviews on topics kind of got a little bit crazy in my opinion.
Like
and I get it. You need to put out papers. You need to do something. So I understand why it happened.
Oh yeah, and it's especially intermittent fasting. It's a popular topic. But
yep,
I remember when I was writing my dissertation, just looking around, like 3 new reviews getting published every single day, and I'm just looking around going, we don't have enough new data.
There's no new data in that
this.
time point.
Like just stick with what we have. All right.
Yeah.
Because then if you publish it, then I have to read it. And I'm trying to write my dissertation. I don't have time to read this.
Yeah. And like you said, you're trying to straddle, various types, 16-8 versus, like Krista Verde has done a lot of the alternate day fasting, and they're trying to wedge all these things under the term of fasting. But yeah, and I get it, because there's not quite enough data, especially some of the early ones, to only look at 16-8 or only look at one type. So you're trying to make these corrections and extrapolations based off of different types because they're all intermittent fasting. And I don't know. I think it got quite confusing.
Yeah. And you bring up a very good point that for especially a lot of people should be aware that for a long time, the vast majority of the fasting research that came out was alternate day fasting or modified alternate day fasting. Well, modified alternate day fasting is essentially just instead of doing a full fast day, you would have a small meal that's typically about 25% of your normal daily calories around the noontime, around lunch. And then outside of that, you would still fast like normal. And they just found that kind of helped with people actually following alternate day fasting. But the more common versions, like the 16-8 or the 20-4, didn't start showing up in the literature really until about 2016, 2017.
Yeah. And then obviously you've got some research on Ramadan, which is kind of its own thing per se, I would say.
Yeah, it's very, very much so its own thing. A lot of people like to group Ramadan literature with intermittent fasting, but it's very hard to do considering The fast can vary widely depending on where in the world that data was collected or the time of year that Ramadan fell upon that year. So sometimes the actual amount of fast for Ramadan isn't coming close to the length of time that some of these intermittent fasting protocols are actually advocating for.
How did you kind of settle on looking at the 16 and 8? Was that something you've observed kind of in your own life, your own hypothesis, or was there just kind of more research on that from obviously Grant Tinsley has done a lot of, stuff in that area. So you kind of wanted to continue on in that area, or what made you kind of go that direction?
And so for the initial reason I was actually mostly interested in 16 and 8 is just because it was the one that I saw the most people doing.
Sure.
And so the biggest thing in my mind is I wanted to study what most people are actually doing to try to figure out what is actually going on there. And so in term like working in stores or with people or just in general trends, 16 and 8 was the one I saw come up by far the most. And at the time, so when I was doing, so it was 2019 when I was doing that study, or actually, yeah, it was January to April 2019. And at the time, there had only been two studies published that had used 16 and 8.
Hmm.
And so it was the Morrow 2016 and the Tinsley 2019, which had used 16 and 8. So it was something that I saw that was very, very common out in the field, but had not been very well represented in the literature. And so because of that, I wanted to dive into it. And I also think it's one of those protocols that is a little easy for people to kind of introduce themselves to, because I know a lot of times when you first tell people like, oh, yeah, don't eat until noon or something. Like it's the old thing of as soon as you tell somebody you can't have something, that's immediately what they want.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
as soon as
Don't think
as
of a
soon
pink
as
elephant. Oh, pink elephants.
exactly. And but when a lot of people actually think about their normal daily life, like it's pretty close to what a fair bit of people do.
Hmm.
Where let's say you wake up too late, so you don't really have breakfast, and then so you might have some coffee on the way to work or something, and then you get busy at work, and then the first time you really have that much substantive food is around lunch, and that's essentially the start of a 16 and 8 protocol. So I think that's one of the reasons it's really popular, and I got into it because I just didn't see a lot of literature on it, but I saw it really popular in the field. Now, because of that, there's starting to be a little bit more literature coming out using 16 and 8, which is good to see. I think one of the big things now that would be good to start going to, there's one study I know of, the Cienfuegos paper, but also starting to examine like 16 and 8 versus 6 and 18 or 4 and 20. Like, what are the big differences we're seeing there? Because so far, there's only one paper I'm aware of that's actually compared some of those protocols directly head to head, but still nothing in exercise.
Do you know the origin of the time frame of the 16 and 8? What I was told, and again, I don't know if this is true or not, or if it's a different realm, but supposedly from Sachin Panda's lab, he was saying that the reason they used an 8-hour feeding window was just the practicality of running things in the lab, because you would have, if you're doing a controlled feeding study, so like an acute study, you would have 8 hours where people are going to be monitored. You'd have like an hour or two, maybe a setup before and an hour or so after that. And that asking grad students to stay in the lab for, more than 10 to 12 hours at a time is just kind of unreasonable. So they needed something that had a working time frame, and they just picked 8 hours. I don't know if that story is just complete folklore by this point, or if there's any truth to that.
Well, if Sachin's actually considering that for his grad students, then he's doing good, because there's a lot of doc advisors out there that would just be like, I don't care, get it done.
Oh, yeah. My advisor would be like, I don't care, sleep in the lab, figure this shit out.
Exactly. So I gotta give him credit if that's one of the reasons he picked 8. That I could see that there are some metabolic reasons I could see potentially closer to the 16-hour fast, like around 16 hours is you start to see some shifts in metabolism. But as far as I'm aware, Or I could see that definitely being a good reason for the origin of it. My my origin of it is just the starting to see it pop up everywhere, and then every time I tried to dive into it, it was just, yeah, this is what people do. Okay, that's not a great reason for an origin, but I know where origins for some of the versions. So, for instance, one of the reasons people have advocated for, say, 20 and 4 in the past is because around the 18-hour mark, you start to see some shifts in especially sympathetic nervous system activity,
Hmm.
which impacts, say, like fat oxidation. Like fat oxidation seems to go up around 18 hours, so you get a little bit of extra time if you fast past the 18-hour mark, that type of thing. But especially for 16 and 8, and then some of the other ones, say like the 14 and 10, those are a little bit more for looking at things like feasibility. Like, I know that's one of the reasons modified alternate day fasting came about, is because they just noticed that they were having astronomically high dropout rates for studies, and so
Yeah.
people just couldn't do it. So they're like, well, if we give them a little bit of food on that fasting day, it helps with lean body mass retention, and then also people can kind of stick to it. And that's one thing I think we need to remember when we're designing some of these protocols. I think some people like to lose sight of. They don't like to lose, they just lose sight of in the industry, is that all these, like, you can design the most scientifically correct, best correct protocol out there, but if people can't stick to it, it doesn't matter. So making these little trade-offs of like, yeah, we might not be hitting that slight shift in fat oxidation around the 18-hour, but my client can actually stick to it long term. So, we'll do this different protocol, that type of thing.
Yeah. I think there's some data that insulin levels in healthy people kind of fall down and hit like kind of a flat point at around, I think it's like 14 to 16 hours or somewhere around in there if you're just completely fasting too. So,
Yeah, I as part of my PhD work, I published a paper in Nutrition Reviews, kind of going over all of that, which today is actually one of the papers that I'm most proud of, but it gets no reads, which makes me sad.
what's the reference?
Uh,
We'll make sure to link it here.
so it's called Physiological Adaptations to Acute Fasting, and it's in the Journal of Nutrition Reviews. And
Nice.
as part of my PhD comps, like, we had to write a review, and so that was one that I had always been interested in, is kind of like the timelines. And so one of the reasons I wanted that was as a way of trying to say, like, if you are actually trying to develop some of these protocols, like, if you're trying to see certain physiological adaptations, like, you need to know the timelines that some of these are going to happen. So the point of that paper was, hopefully, like, if you wanted to see certain rising ketones or certain plateau out of insulin levels or something like that, how long do you actually need to fast to have that, so you can make sure that you're designing protocols that actually achieve that.
For while you mentioned it, what would you say is the length of time for fasting for most people to see, I'll say, a significant rise in ketones, but you can define that as to whatever level you think is significant, I guess.
I mean, we can see actually a measurable rise in just after an overnight fast, but significantly, and of course, this is going to be very dependent on a lot of different things.
Yeah,
Um,
exercise, metabolic health, a whole bunch
yeah,
of stuff.
yeah, adiposity. So how, yeah, basically everything you just mentioned. Yeah. But I was like, yeah. And, but I'd say much closer to around that, like 14 to 16-hour mark, is because one of the big things that does need to happen for that is, liver glycogen levels to start to be depleted, which they can be depleted after an overnight fast.
Mm,
But, and if you're looking for a certain percentage, I do have a nice chart in that paper that actually
nice.
shows the percentages that all the different studies showed with different lengths of fasting and all that kind of stuff. But also, one of the issues I will say that is kind of interesting when diving into that literature, when trying to say how much of a rise, most of those studies don't start actually measuring baseline until close to about 12 hours of fasting already. There are
Oh,
only
interesting.
there are only a few studies, a very, very few studies, like the Klein 1993 and such, that actually looked at, say, time points only at, say, 4 or 6 hours postprandial, so after finished eating, vast majority of studies didn't actually start collecting data until about 8 to 12 hours after eating
Is that
of fasting.
just kind of a practicality thing, or it's the old school thing where, have your last meal at a certain point, come into the lab in the morning fasted, and then they do all their poking and prodding during the day. So their first measurement might be whenever they get them into the lab in the morning.
That's definitely, I think, part of it. Some of those papers some of the better ones are actually inpatient studies.
Oh, nice.
So where they were able to continually draw over time. But as anyone that's been in research can tell you, that's very expensive and very hard to do. And you need to have very specialized facilities, which is why a lot of us don't do it. But that's one of the big things that I know I really had to come to grips with and learn when I started getting into research is when you start reading a lot of things and you're like, why didn't they do it this way? Why didn't they do it this way? And then you start to learn it's because of practicality things like you're mentioning, where it's like for a lot of those, they tell an individual, all right, have your last meal at 10 p.m. and then we'll see you in the lab at 6 a.m. That ends up being an 8-hour fast, as opposed because they're not going to be able to draw all the blood markers and everything that they want at 4 a.m. because hopefully they have advisors like Panda that isn't sending their doc students to their house or making the part. Because same thing, if I told the participant to come in and be like, you're going to sleep in the lab and we're going to draw you at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
Trying to recruit for that study would be impossible.
Yeah. It's hard enough to get, I found, average college students to come into the lab to exercise at 5:30 in the morning. That was difficult. And you tell them, it's going to be a max test. And then God forbid, if you have any blood draws on top of that, like get good freaking luck.
And then if you get the participants that we really like, and people like to complain that we don't have, so like the really well-trained participants.
Yeah.
As soon as you tell them they need to change their training a little bit and be like, oh, we need you to take a couple days off, or like, or this next 3 weeks of training might look a little bit different, then everyone's like, all right, I'm out.
Yeah. And I get that. Like when I was at the University of Minnesota, my buddy Cal Dietz he's still there, but he was running, a lot of the collegiate strength and coaching there. And so I often joke that I'm like, if I went over to him and be like, hey, Cal, I need like your top, 24 athletes. I'm going to have them do your normal protocol. And then I want to put them on my special protocol I want to look at over here. And I want to run this for like 4 months. Oh, in your peak season. He'd be like, F off, like screw you. Like, what are you doing? Like his entire job is to get the best results safely that he can from his athletes. His job is not to give me athletes to screw around with in a study because study may not work so well, So I get the criticism that we need more elite level athletes, and the answer is yes, but the practicality of doing that, especially in the US, is very, very difficult.
Very, very, very difficult. And that's what I tell a lot of students, where they'll say like, I really want to study this one population because I can't find that much in this population. And then after I was like, I guarantee there's people before you that have come before you that want to do the research in that population. The reason that there isn't that much literature in that population is because that population is next to impossible to recruit, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we only have, the unfortunate aspect is we only have a certain amount of time to do studies.
Yep.
And especially at universities, a lot of our studies have to run in concert with the semester.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of studies past, say, 12, 16 weeks as well is because how long is an academic semester here? 16 weeks. And if you and most of our participants are, say, students. And so as soon as you get around holidays or at the end of semesters, they're going home, they're leaving campus, and then all of our participants just left. So good luck if you wanted to do a 20-week or something like that.
Yeah. And even just the amount of expectations of it. I just studied on energy drinks, and we had a randomized placebo controlled arm, all that kind of stuff. And people are like, oh, but you didn't use water as a placebo. Like we kind of used a non-caffeinated version that didn't have the other ingredients in it. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, that's a fair criticism, but to add a third arm onto that study means that it's going to be longer. It's going to be more expensive. The people have to come in from one extra time. They're already doing 3 max tests during it. So now you're asking them to do a 4th max test. And as you know, if you run the stats on that and people start dropping out, you can't really use anything from their other 2 trials either. So you run the risk of potentially imploding your whole study by adding another arm. It may work out. It may not. You don't know until you're almost done with the darn study. So it's just like, I'm not risking it. Someone else can run that one. I agree with the statement. Yes, but I want to graduate.
Exactly. I did a very similar one with pre-workouts at Texas Tech, where we looked at a caffeinated pre-workout, the same pre-workout, but without caffeine, and then placebo. But one of the is like, if we wanted to do a, say, caffeine only version of it, then similarly that would have moved the number of total visits from 75 to 100.
Yeah.
And just even outside of all of that, the amount of extra work then you're
logistics
asking
too.
your lab to do is crazy. So you start learning all the little trade-offs, and then all of a sudden all the things that you're sitting there going like, well, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do this? All those things start making sense. You're like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Out of curiosity, what did you find in that study?
So for that particular study, we did not find a difference in main performance between any of the 3 conditions. We did find.
And what were the 3 conditions again? We had the pre-workout.
Yeah, we had a caffeinated pre-workout, and then we had, so it was Legion's Pulse pre-workout. So Legion, the pre-workout was Pulse. And so we looked at the caffeinated version versus the non-caffeinated version versus a placebo, and which was just Crystal Light. We just wanted something that tasted the same. And main differences, we didn't find any real performance differences except for isometric mid-thigh strength. And so how that worked was, isometric half squat, is we had a really cool kind of isokinetic squat device. It was kind of a pain to use, but gave some interesting data. And so when people in both of the pre-workout groups, so caffeinated and non-caffeinated, when we set the device, that essentially would be a half squat for them, and then just ask them to push against it as hard as possible. Both pre-workout groups did better in that version, in that test, than the placebo. There wasn't a difference between caffeinated and non-caffeinated. When we looked at 1RM and repetitions to failure, there wasn't any difference between any of the 3 groups.
Interesting.
But so that was, I think, we also used a absolute dose, which we tried to limit it so that every time that someone took someone, if they would fall still within that 3 to 6 milligrams per kg. So limited body weights coming in for that. So it was still within the physiological dose, but the lighter females versus larger males, there's some stuff there. Also, one of the things I think back to that study a lot is how often does someone go into the gym and just do like a 1RM bench and then throw 65 and then a certain percentage of their body weight on the bar and see how many reps you can do, and then do a 1RM leg press and do the same thing and then leave. So it didn't impact it in those methods, but I'd still argue that there's good argument for why you might want to some people might want to take one even for just general workouts, because one, that's not the most ecologically valid testing to see how it's going to affect, like, say, a normal workout that someone might go do, but it's what the company wanted. So we tested the variables that they wanted. And good thing about Legion is they didn't care whether we found null results or positive results. They let us publish it either way, but they were curious how it affected muscular endurance and maximal strength. And so that's what we tested. But also, especially for pre-workouts, or energy drinks and stuff like that, I think there's a lot of psychological aspects that go into it. People like take their pre-workout and then go, okay, now I've taken my pre-workout. Now it's time to go train. So whether or not that pre-workout is actually improving their performance in the gym, that pre-workout got them to the gym.
Yeah.
And they're going to get better results because they actually went to the gym. Versus if they didn't take that pre-workout, they might have not trained at all. So, like, even if it's just the non-caffeinated ones. Like there's some behavioral aspects that I think they can be beneficial for.
Yeah, there's something to be said about the ritualistic aspect of it, and you're having the same kind of flavor. And also a tip to all the bros taking their pre-workout in the locker room before they set foot on the floor. Unless your warm-up is like 30 to 60 minutes, you may want to back up your dose a little bit sooner than that, because like peak levels of caffeine are like 30 to 60 minutes, somewhere in there. Yep. So what was the dose of caffeine on that, just out of curiosity?
I believe it was 300. It was 250 or 300.
Oh, okay. So significant.
And yeah, it was a good dose. And also the one thing that I liked about it, which I'm partial to ones that also include theanine in it, just because I found theanine doesn't make the caffeine hit quite as hard.
Yeah, it definitely mellows it out.
Exactly. And so that had a good dose of theanine in it to help with, mental focus a little bit more. But also, like, I've noticed with some of the higher ones, and I remember a time in the supplement industry when 350 was like really, really high, and I was like, oh yeah. Crap.
Yeah.
And then now I talked to a couple of my students that are also working at some of the local supplement stores, like, oh yeah, we just got this new one in that has 600 milligrams of caffeine.
Oh my God.
But so occasionally, especially say if it was like a leg day or squat or something like that, where getting your heart rate racing, if I had something that had a decent amount of theanine in there, then I'd still get a little bit of the perk, but I noticed my heart I wouldn't feel like I needed to find a respirator after every single set.
Yeah, it does feel surprisingly different. Like I've used a mix of like 400 or 500 milligrams of caffeine with like 250 milligrams of L-theanine, just to see what the difference was. And it definitely is very noticeable. And I actually don't like it as much. If you've ever done it, it's a weird feeling. It's like you don't have quite that, I guess I would relate it to almost like sympathetic drive, but yet you still feel the effects of caffeine. It's a very, I don't know why, like I don't like the sensation of it for some reason, but I know a lot of people like it better.
It was actually kind of funny as we were getting ready to do that particular study. The tubs that we got sent were unmarked, obviously, so that we could all stay blinded.
Right.
But the person who was mixing it, so one of the things I thought was actually really cool about that particular study is, a lot of people will do double blind, placebo control, all that kind of good stuff. But actually the person who mixed the drinks like didn't interact and knew it didn't interact with the participants at all, essentially.
Yeah.
So they mixed it in a different room and then came in and put it in the fridge so we could control the temperature that they drank it at and all that kind of stuff that was in the testing room, and then left. And then we didn't see them at all. So we could keep all of that separate. And so so at one point the guy who fixed all of it was trying to figure out essentially like which one, after we wrapped the study and everything, he was trying to figure out which ones was. So he was trying all of them. And he was like, oh yeah, well, this one, it has like 300 milligrams of caffeine. That should be pretty obvious, like which one's the caffeine one. And then I remember him drinking it and he was like, yeah, this is weird, man. I don't know what's going on. Like, I think this is the caffeine one, but I don't know because like I'm not getting the normal caffeine hit because of the theanine. And I was like, yeah, it's very different. But I still remember walking around the lab like that. And it was really funny because he had never tried one like that.
Yeah. And definitely I know the trend is higher on caffeine because in terms of legal stimulants, it's kind of the only one left. I mean, there's some gray area stuff depending upon how far you want to push the line, but it just seems like we've seen trends of, like in the past it was like how concentrated can you make your pre-workout, and if you have in this tiny scoop that was better, and then it was like the kitchen sink version again, and then it was like, no, we don't want too much caffeine, and you had DMMA and other things you could put in, and now it's back to, oh, but people want a stimulant effects. We're back to like, hyperdosing on caffeine again.
Yeah, it's getting close. But I remember back when like 1MR and like 1MR Vortex and and the original Nitroflex and all those were getting really popular. But the funny thing is, even back then, the super high dosed ones, like I remember at the store, the original Proceps Mr. Hyde was the highest caffeine dosed one we sold, which was 419 milligrams of caffeine. Then N-methyltyrene, himbine, rewolf, ornithine, synephrine, all that
Mm-hmm.
on top of it. But
Yep.
419 now, while still up there, it's like you have a very wide range of ones that are that and above. When
Yeah.
at the time that was like 100 milligrams more than everything else. So it's kind of crazy to look back. And granted, that was 2015, so even before that, like it when I started getting into it. But when we started selling them, that was 2015 to 2017 ish, around there, 2014.
Yeah.
But that it's still crazy to look back and like, oh, that was 7, 8, 9 years ago now.
Yeah. It's wild. What was your top 2 or 3 favorite pre-workouts of even things in the past or things that are available now?
Okay, so one that I liked for a long time was I honestly haven't looked to see current formulations or if they're around as much recently. I really liked Nutrex Outlift at the
Hmm.
time. I thought that had a really good blend. That also had that 350. PS Science makes one, blanking on the name, but I actually have it
You'll
in my
think of
kitchen right now.
it.
Prolific, that's what it's called.
Okay.
I liked that one because it still had a decent amount, but it was also like it was the amount of they sent you was enough for the typical like 20, 30 servings, but the serving was 2 scoops. So if
Hmm.
it was a day that I didn't want to go too crazy with it, I could just do 1 scoop, or if I was having a rough day, I could do the two
Yeah.
scoop, and the formulation was pretty good. Actually, the best. This is when you start to have problems when you start also ranking them by taste. Not necessarily like the one that I enjoyed taking the most, but I still to this day think back to the ones uh, that at the store, because we'd sit there and like everyone has the like wine sifters and like
Hmm.
gotta your wine tasting. We had pre-workout tastings, but Gat's Nitroflex Black Cherry, and then the Bang Master Blaster,
Hmm.
the lemonade one of that one was really really good. That those were the ones that I would kind of go to the most thing back. If I wanted to actually another thing, but if I wanted a kind of lower dose one, I used to like the ProSubs Dr. Jekyll because it was only 100
Okay.
milligrams of
Hmm.
caffeine, so still kind of below what you would typically say for that 3 to 6 milligrams. But it was enough to kind of like perk me up towards the end of the day, but not anything to like go crazy, so I could still go to bed decently after taking it, because during that period of time in my life I was training from like 9 to 11 o'clock at night,
Oh,
so,
wow.
and then had to get up at 4 a.m. to go work my morning job and everything the next day. So wanted something that gave me a little bit but not too much. But yeah, those are the main ones that kind of come to mind. I'm sure
Got it.
there's more that will come to me later. I'm like, why didn't I say that one? But
Did you ever try Craze by DS Nutrition? Were you around when that was out, or is that before your
uh
time even?
no, I saw it. We never carried it though, so I never tried it.
Okay. It
And
was that's still probably my favorite, although later it's come out that the compound in it is probably illegal and very people say it was meth-like in structure, but I mean, if you talk to any organic chemistry, that's kind of a very loaded term, but it was
yeah.
very good for focusing, but it was not a super high stim, but had like weird, I don't want to say side effects, but even main effects. Like I just started sweating profusely after I would make it. Not like I was hot or I felt temperature changes, but yeah, that was interesting. I think they have isolated what the compound they put in there, which was not a extract from uranium. It was a completely man-made synthetic compound. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's everyone I know in this space has like weird stories like that. Like I still remember when I first started getting into this, there was a local supplement store down by the gym that I trained at, and I got to know the owner of it pretty well. And I came in one day and he's like, "We just got this new thermogenic, and you got to try it." And I was like, "All right." I was like, "Fine, I'll try it." I remember it still makes me laugh because it was called Poison, And
Oh, I remember getting samples of that at the Arnold.
yeah, ALRI industry is poison.
Yeah.
And I just remember
They
taking
had the
it
skull
and
on the front, like the black label in the background and stuff.
I just remember taking it and then laying in my bed in my apartment, just with the room spinning, just sweating, just like, what did I just do? And then I learned if I took it and while I was fasted and didn't eat, then something like that would happen. But if I took it and ate, then that wouldn't happen. So then I started, anytime I took it, then I'd immediately eat afterwards. But at the time I was not eating great. So basically completely defeated the whole purpose of it because it was a weight loss thermogenic. And then I eat that and immediately, so that I didn't have some of the side effects, walk across the street to Del Taco and get like a bunch of tacos.
Yeah, I
But
remember taking the twin fuel, the rip fuel, like back in the day
yeah.
when that was like the first one I ever tried. And, at the time it was hard to try to figure out how much caffeine was actually in it. And at the
Mhm.
time I was doing my master's and I used to lift at 7 o'clock at night, but most of my schedule, I didn't have class until 9. So I'd take that before I'd lift at 7 at night, go lift for an hour or two, and then end up like studying till like 3 in the morning, crash for a few hours, get up later. But yeah, I think back now and go, oh, it wasn't the best idea to take that at like almost 8 p.m. at night. But I guess if you stay up later, whatever. But yeah, definitely worked.
I mean, it worked for you, I guess.
Yeah, cool. So on the 16 and 8 fasting, what are your thoughts about one, is it beneficial for body composition? And then the second part is, do you think that would be superior to other programs, or do you think it's an equivalent option?
For other programs, do you mean other diets or other fasting
Just other
programs?
diets or other things, because my take on it is I don't generally have people start there, but if I have people that I'm working with who have been doing it and who are successful, I tend to just leave them on it. I haven't read any literature that I think it's going to be completely detrimental. If somebody asked me personally, and this is a little bit more theoretical, there's not as much data on this, which one I would do, I would probably say if you're really wanting to push body composition, I still favor a longer day of fasting and then other days having more protein, maybe having more neutral calories. But I can't say that's based off of any nice study. That's still very theoretical.
Yeah. So in terms of things like body composition, at least with the data that we have out there has shown is pretty much what all these different protocols are doing is just tricking you into eating less.
Yeah.
And so
Shocker,
we have,
physics still works.
yeah, yeah, that's what I always say. It's like, the shocker, laws of thermodynamics still work. And so, especially in these free living situations where we tell people to just go start eating 16 and 8, 14 and 10, 24, whatever, on average, people cut their calories by about 20%. So, a pretty good deficit.
That's pretty good.
And there's a few studies suggest about 500 to 550 calories in some instances. And, that's around what, we typically might tell some people to cut their calories by when they're dieting.
Yeah, it's a
So
theoretical loss of a pound a week.
yeah. And so artificially, without thinking about it, people are doing that. Now in calorie controlled situations, so far we haven't found actually a difference between something like a 16 and 8 and just a normal day of eating. So like my thesis, for instance, was the first calorie controlled study, and we didn't find a difference. Now, granted, again, just because of some of the constraints that we were talking about earlier, it was only 4 weeks long. So within 4 weeks, we didn't see a difference. And that's one of the other things to consider is with all of these studies, some of the really, especially if we're looking at exercising populations, which, when people are dieting, we want them to be exercising as well. The longest studies out there are 8 to 12 weeks.
Yeah.
But that's why, even though I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting, I still am not going to say that everyone should fast or this is the thing that everyone should do or this is the magic bullet for anything. It's just it's a tool that, like, for instance, for me, like, I like to use it for when I don't really want to count calories, like when I'm traveling or something like that. But if I'm being good about tracking everything, then I'm not going to worry too much about fasting. So, but theoretically, yes, in an ideal world, I think, especially if someone's trying to, say, maintain as much muscle mass, having the more protein feedings throughout the day is probably going to be a little bit more ideal. The more times that you can spike, muscle protein synthesis, blunt breakdown, which breakdown is already increased during deficits and all that kind of stuff. The nice thing is, though, especially for fasting, is so far all of the studies, which granted it's like two, looking at does muscle protein breakdown actually really significantly increase to a point within some of these fasting window times that we see during time restricted eating. We don't really see that big of an increase, which is potentially one of the reasons why we see people are still able to maintain muscle while dieting, provided they're still eating enough protein. So that's also one of
Yeah.
the big things, is provide they're eating enough protein. Because so far, the only exercise study out there that has showed someone losing muscle mass, which was the Tinsley 2017 paper, they were doing the 20 and 4, but they only did 20 and 4 on days that they were not exercising.
Mm.
So on exercising days, they had them eat normally, and then did 24. They exercised 3 times a week, and then did a 20 and 4 on non-exercising days. But the group that did that, because again, remember that particular paper was just, if we tell people to do this, how do their dietary practices change? Not necessarily trying to like track tell them to eat certain ways. The group that was doing the 20 and 4 decreased their protein to about 1 gram per kg. So well
Mm.
below the 1.2 or 1.4 basement that
Right.
a lot of things would recommend. And so that's also one of the things, especially if you're working with individuals that are kind of free living doing this, and you're not telling them specific macronutrients to eat or specific amounts of macronutrients, to remind them they might need to bias their meals towards protein, because the main macronutrient that we see that people like to cut out when they do these is protein, and that's going to lead to much worse body composition changes. And then in terms of just straight body composition, so far, again, like, we don't have any data to really suggest that a 16 and 8 is going to be better than a 20 and 4 or better than an 18 and 6. The only study close to that is the Cienfuegos, I believe it was 2020, was the Cienfuegos paper, which was a 6-hour feeding window versus a 4-hour feeding window. And again, it was a very short period of time. I believe it was about 4 to 6 weeks, but they did not find any differences between a 6-hour and a 4-hour. And a lot of times I like to, when working with people, I like to bias a little bit closer to the longer feeding windows, just because that gives people more flexibility to kind of put it in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And as opposed to someone sitting there going, okay, I can only eat for 4 hours. So I need to make sure I'm around, food at this particular 4 hour. And if life happens and I'm busy during that period of time randomly, then I'm like SOL. So the longer feeding windows give people a little bit more opportunity to still kind of fit their daily life into it a little bit better. And like you were kind of saying, even with 16 and 8, that might not be where I'd like to start somebody, because still, don't think of a pink elephant, even though some people, that might not be extreme of what they do naturally. As soon as you tell them they can't eat until noon, they're going to feel like it's a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
Starting off with some of the longer feeding window protocols, like the 14 and 10 or something like that. And then if they feel comfortable with it, start slowly kind of increasing that fasting window. Because while so far in terms of body composition, we haven't found any benefit, there isn't great data on this, but there's theoretical data that the longer fasting windows may help for things like insulin sensitivity and that type of stuff. So if you're dealing with somebody that is really has some metabolic stuff going on, like, there's some theoretical reasons that some of those longer windows might be beneficial. But again, we need a lot more data on that to confirm or kind of refute that, because most of that right now is also in either very clinical populations, so only dealing with people with like pre-diabetics, type 2 diabetes, or animal data. And especially when fasting, animal data is really, really hard to transfer to humans, because a 16-hour fast for a mouse, because they're much, much faster metabolism, is very, very different than a 16-hour fast for a human. And so especially when things like, because in the intermittent fasting realm, I hear people bring up things like autophagy all the time.
Oh yeah.
And um, and we have and that's pretty much all coming from mice data. Like we don't really have that much data about autophagy in humans with the length of fast from time restricted eating. And but as people extrapolating that from mice, we have to also keep that in mind, especially when we're looking at like metabolic markers, improvements of that. But we do have recently some like the Sutton 2020 paper that showed some really interesting differences in some insulin sensitivity, augmentation index, and a few things like that in a 6-hour feeding window. Now, Grant, that was one of the first ones to actually do what's called early time restricted feeding,
Hmm.
which it came out of Courtney Peterson's lab, who's done some good work with early time restricted feeding, which, if people aren't aware, early time restricted feeding is basically, or time restricted eating. I use the two terms interchangeably. I know some researchers in my field get really uppity about TRF versus TRE.
Oh yeah.
Um, I
Uh,
think as long as people know what you're referring to,
yeah, as long as you
really
define it,
good.
I think you're fine.
Yeah. So, but and just out of old habit, because when I started this, it was TRF. I still subconsciously sometimes revert to TRF instead of TRE, but they're essentially the same thing. They're the same thing. That's so instead of doing say a 16 and 8, sorry, not a noon to 8 p.m. feeding window, you move that window up a little bit. And so you might eat from say 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. or something like that. So for instance, in that particular study, everyone finished eating by, I believe it was 3 o'clock. It was either 2 or 3 o'clock in the day. And there's a couple really short studies. There's one study out of a lab, I believe in Japan, that I always blank on their name of the paper just because I can't pronounce it very well. And that basically looked at early versus delayed time restricted eating, which delayed is the version that vast majority of people are used to, and looked at things like insulin responses to meals and found some potential benefit to the early time restricted feeding. But the big question I always have to ask with that is, again, like that may be great if there's some extra metabolic stuff going on there, but how realistic is to tell all of your patients or your clients or whomever they need to be done eating by 4 o'clock in the day and they can't go home and have dinner with their kids?
Yeah, that's very hard. Like even with the 24-hour fast, one of the pros of how I sell it is, it takes several weeks to work up to it, just doing it one day per week. And then even once you hit 24 hours, if you do that, say Sunday night to Monday night, you can still have dinner with your family both nights. And they're like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. I know that's one of the reasons when I first started doing like Eat Stop Eat and stuff like that, like
Mm-hmm.
that worked well for me. Because that's one of the things, it's when I'm studying this, I actually have like participated in all of these different versions. So that, because I think if you're going to study it, you should have some personal experience with it as
Definitely.
well. So, and ironically, especially with fasting, most of it came before I was even like in research and stuff like that. But spend a fair bit of time doing alternate day fasting, whole day fasting, TRE. Um, the only one I haven't really done is my longest fast was 48 hours. I haven't really done the like 72 or something like that yet. But
Yeah.
I don't study a ton of long term or periodic fasting. So I think I can make an argument for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Longest I've gone is 38 hours. And that was okay. I mean, at that point, I probably could have gone longer. I was just like, I don't
That
know.
is
I
one
just
of
kind of
the
stopped there.
that is one of the interesting things that me and a few other fasting researchers have talked about, but we haven't been able to set up a study to do this quite yet. But looking at hunger levels throughout it, because anyone I've
Yeah.
talked to that's done some of those will all say kind of the same thing, where there's certain, you kind of reach a point where you're just not hungry anymore, and you almost like, it's weird to say, but you kind of forget that you're hungry, and then when you start eating again, that's when all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you realize you're hungry. So when you are around that, like say 38, 36, 40, 48-hour fast or something, psychologically be curious to see what's kind of going on there, because most people, when they break their fast at that point, usually hear the same thing where they're like, well, I wasn't like, I could have definitely gone longer, or
Mm-hmm.
like it, you hit a point where it wasn't too bad, but I felt like kind of should, or like it worked for the schedule, or I only plan to go this long, that type of thing. But looking at Grant and I have talked about a couple times, trying to set up something to look at kind of some of those markers to see how quickly people kind of adapt, because that's also one of the other things to consider for a lot of people is when they first start doing some of these protocols, they're usually going to feel very hungry.
Oh yeah.
But usually that should go away not too after not too long. We don't have great data on the timeline for that, but some of the current data shows about, for most people, about two-ish to 4 weeks, you should start seeing some significant decreases in hunger during those fasting times. But if you've got somebody that's never done it before and then wants to jump straight in, if as soon as you start telling yourself, I can't eat,
Yeah.
you're gonna be hungry.
Do you think with the longer fast that you may be producing more ketone bodies and those may be having an appetite blunting effect, or any thoughts on what you think the mechanism is?
I do think there's a couple things. I like with the ketones, definitely, because ketones by themselves do decrease appetite.
Mm-hmm.
We do have some pretty good data on that. And so especially in those extended fasts, ketone levels can get pretty high. Around that 36 to 48-hour mark is when we're seeing them start to approach some of the levels that you would actually see if somebody went on a ketogenic style diet.
Yeah. So around 2 millimolar, possibly higher.
Yeah. And so that is definitely one of the things that could be going on. I'd be very interested to also look at some hormone, some stuff like peptide YY, ghrelin, leptin, those kind of things, because you do see inverse relationships when you start fasting. Ghrelin makes you hungry. Ghrelin initially starts to go up, but then that kind of, most of the data we have hasn't actually been extended fully out to say 48 72 hours when looking at those hormones. Unfortunately, we have some good acute fasting studies that have been taken out to like 72 hours, but unfortunately they were looking mostly at things like ketone bodies or something like that, and in ketone, insulin, glucose, stuff like that, as opposed to leptin and ghrelin and all that. So it would be interesting to see if there's any kind of phasic response where, say, like most things, where you see maybe a initial spike in ghrelin and it starts to come back down, and inversely related to leptin and all that, and leptin potentially going up after a certain period of time, would be very interesting. But I think currently, I think my best guess would be in relation to the ketones, kind of like you mentioned.
Yeah. Awesome. The last question as we wrap up, like anything you can divulge on some of the breakfast studies, because I've looked at some of this literature. I haven't looked at it real recently, but everyone's probably heard, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And I know my bias is I love breakfast. I could eat breakfast almost every meal of the day per se. But then you see other data that says, no, if you skip breakfast, it was better. And then other data says, no, if you skip breakfast, you ate more later in the day and then it was bad. And it just seems like it's all over the map.
And you're not wrong. It is kind of all over the map, because like I was mentioning earlier, how intermittent fasting typically works is people skip breakfast,
right,
and they cut their calories by about 20%, because we have a couple studies suggesting that people will eat more the first meal after, when they start eating again. So for instance, you skip breakfast, you eat, the first time you eat is lunch, people will increase the amount of food that they eat at lunch, but they don't increase it enough to make up for the amount that they skipped for breakfast. And then the next meals, like say dinner, is kind of back to what you would normally expect. But then we do have a few studies just that say, oh, well, actually, if you skip breakfast, and people ate more the rest of the day and all that kind of stuff. But I would say, considering all the stuff going on, all the intermittent fasting literature coming out nowadays, I would bias a little bit more towards you skip breakfast, people don't make up the calories a little bit later. Then in terms of performance, again, it's very limited in terms of, say, how breakfast is, say, going to impact training, say, later in the day. That was kind of what my dissertation was about, was what happens to afternoon training if you skip breakfast, but if you eat the same amount of food. So basically, we had people come in and we gave them the same amount of food, either at lunch or split up between breakfast and lunch. and then put them through a squat, bench, deadlift workout. And we didn't find any performance differences in that. There is some data using, so we were the only ones to do it in resistance training. There's a little bit of data in cyclists and rowers, potentially suggesting performance might be very, very slightly inhibited, but most of those inhibitions where you're looking at like 8 seconds on a time trial. But also keep in mind, all those studies, again, kind of like I was talking about the pre-workout study that I did a while ago, they were using time trials, so like races. So
how long was the time trial they were using?
One of them, so it was a 25-kilometer time trial for the cycling.
Okay.
And which that study, I think that was the Metcalf paper, which resulted in about a 3.5% decrease, so which ended up being about 28 seconds.
Okay.
Versus the rowing paper, which was 2 kilometers.
Yeah, 2K.
And that one ended up being an 8-second difference, which was a 0.8% difference. And
yeah, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for someone who is rowing a 2K to improve their 2K, and you told me I could do something to shave 8 seconds off my 2K like today, I'd be all over that.
Well, so, and that's where I think
that's where the context matters too.
Yeah, the context is a big thing there, where one, we have to look at who is doing it. So are you talking about an elite athlete where 8 seconds could be the difference between, making the Olympics or watching from the couch at home?
Yeah.
Or like winning the Olympics and watching from the couch at home? Or are you talking about someone who just wants to go row a little bit after work to get some cardio in?
Yeah.
Like to them, the 8 seconds might not matter that much. And then two, I think about like, okay, so what this also might tell me is on competition days, I might make sure to eat breakfast or something like that. But on a general training day where it's submax as opposed to a full like time trial, because my dissertation, I really wanted it to be mimic close to a more normal training session. So we did like submaximal work, which is what vast majority of people, when they go to the gym, are doing submaximal work. And so in that submax, we might not see a difference. The other really interesting one, I think there are 2 big papers that kind of point to this, is the Mears 2018 in cycling, and then with resistance training, the Haruden 2020 paper. Basically, they came up with this interesting thing. They called it a viscous placebo. That's how they mentioned it in the paper, which sounds kind of funny to me. Where basically they had people either take like a placebo, which they said was water, and then a carbohydrate drink, or this viscous placebo. So the viscous placebo, they basically tricked them into thinking that they were consuming calories.
So like a soluble, insoluble fiber type mix of some form or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in this particular, granted, these 2 papers were looking at training fasted versus training fed, as opposed to how breakfast affects performance later in the day. And what they found is when they gave people those viscous placebo, actually there weren't any performance differences between the carbohydrate drink and the viscous placebo, but there were performance differences between those 2 groups in the water.
Interesting.
So what that potentially points towards is there's a large psychological component going on of people thinking, oh, I haven't eaten as much today, or I haven't eaten at all. I should do worse on this. And so I'm going to do worse.
Yeah. So like a nocebo effect from it.
Yeah. Which also, the other thing to keep in mind is all of those studies were conducted in individuals that habitually eat breakfast.
Yeah, that's the other part I've noticed too.
Yeah. So our paper that we have under review right now is actually the first one to look at equal amounts of people who habitually consume breakfast and people who habitually skip breakfast.
Nice.
So that's going to be kind of interesting. But again, I think the biggest thing that I found kind of with it is if it's like competition day, race day, something like that, and I'm worrying about max all out performance like that, then breakfast might be beneficial. If it's just a general training session, I'm just going to worry about having the person do what they can and what they can stick to. And then as long as the amount of food consumed before the training session is the same, then I'm happy, essentially. Because the only studies that looked at like later in the day that controlled for calories was ours and the Metcalf paper.
Hmm.
And the Metcalf was cycling versus ours was lifting. And so they were the one. Metcalf did find that difference, but again, that was the 25-kilometer time trial. And then versus ours was 4 sets of squat, 4 sets of bench, 4 sets of deadlift at 80% of 1 RM. And so, yeah, context matters a lot. That's the number one thing that I always try to impugn into my students, is that nothing is either always good or always bad. It's all about how you use it and the context in which it's employed and who you're using it with and all of that. So just like with that data or intermittent fasting data or anything in our field, that's the beauty of working in applied science, is that the correct answer is always, it depends.
Yeah. Yeah. And there does seem to be something about, we've done this with a couple of my clients several times, where one guy in particular, his background carbohydrate intake at the time was like 350 grams per day. And that was a little bit lower for him. So we had him do a max row, and I can't remember if it was I think it was a 500 meter. And we did it under the condition where he was just at his normal 350, which was actually low for him. And the following week, he did it with 100 grams higher. So I think we bumped him up to 450, or it might even been 500. And we saw a difference of almost like 40 or 50 watts. And so we've repeated that with him a few times. And again, this is a complete all-out, maximal test. I've done that on a few other people too. And normally the higher acute intake does seem to translate to a better all-out performance. But again, like you mentioned, how much of that is neurologic? How much of that is actually a physical power output? Who knows? Maybe those people are just better at using carbohydrates. But to me, it was not expected, because if you would have asked me, I would have said, oh man, he's got plenty of carbohydrates. Like, on a short race, there's no way it's not dropping glycogen stores that much. But I don't know. There seems to be something interesting about being in a caloric surplus. And then back to what you were saying about just even placebo stuff, which makes you think of the mouth rinse studies where they're trying to figure out, okay, we did it with carbohydrate solution, you spit it out, and then we look at your performance, and then we did it with artificial sweeteners, and we've done it with water. And I mean, the best I can tell from any of those studies is that maybe if your body is perceiving something sweet, it's thinking, like a feed forward mechanism, there's carbohydrates coming in so we can exercise a little bit harder. But as far as I can tell from that literature, it's not super straightforward either.
Yeah, and it's not, and it gets even more complicated when there's studies showing the improved performance, but only when they had caffeine as well.
Oh yeah, the caffeine makes, that's even another, yeah.
but yeah, and that's also, I think, another good point to come in talking about kind of the anecdotal experience there, where to keep in mind like what true evidence-based practice actually is with individuals is, remember, in research, we're just reporting averages, we're reporting means. And so we're saying on average, this is the type of thing that we see. So that's a good place to start, but then you need to adjust it with what your client is displaying in order to help them the best, and not just be like, well, the literature says this. So even though I know that you see that, this is happening when we do this, but that goes against the literature. So I'm not going to do that with you. And it's like, no, if you're seeing that your client or patient or whomever responds in a certain way, then do that.
Yeah.
Like your job is to help them, not to be like, well, this paper says this, so all of the world must be like this. It's like that the literature is there to help us try to understand things, but also know kind of where to start and give us ideas of what direction to move in, but not absolutely 100% dictate what directions we move. So if you find your client does better with higher carbohydrate intake, even though the bout that they're doing shouldn't be super carbohydrate dominant, and performance is the main thing that matters to them, go do that.
Yeah. I think that's the list from my buddy Sean Casey, where it's research gives us the direction, but me search gives us the answer. Right. So a practitioner, you should know the research, because that's going to help you probably narrow some stuff down, and then, try it out and know what the limitations are of that. I also like, which I wish all studies would do this, it's gotten a lot better. Just show me what the raw data is of everybody in there. Don't just give me the summary stats. That's important. But if I see some like super high standard deviation and I don't see all the raw data, I'm starting to think, okay, why did some people respond better or worse? Or I remember years ago, Stu Phillips putting up this chart of, muscular gains after, I think it was a 12-week hypertrophy program. And he put up the scatter plot. Most people are in the middle. There's two guys like way, way up at the top. And there's one poor bastard who lost muscle, technically, like during the study. And I'm like, that's fascinating.
And sometimes that's really needed to improve the interpretation of it. Like the classic example of that I think back is the 1983 Finney paper, which was one of the first papers look at
the keto paper.
The keto paper, cyclists, where they found a benefit for time to exhaustion at 63% of VO2 max, but it was all driven by one person, because there were only 5 people in the study, and it was all driven by one person that massively improved, when the other 2 people stayed the exact same and the other 2 people massively decreased. But then the one person improved so much that it made the averages show that there was improve in time to exhaustion.
And I specifically took a position presenting at a talk years ago because I knew Steve Finney was presenting. So I got to go to the dinner, hang out with him, and we're riding on the bus on the way back, because that point always bugged me. And obviously, he did the study. So I asked him, I said, hey, I'm not trying to be critical. I just want to know, what did you observe when you did it? Was there, something different about this guy? What was actually going on? He looked at me and he goes, yeah, I like walking my dogs. And then he like walked off. I'm like, what? He just like didn't even acknowledge it all and just removed himself from the conversation. I was like, okay.
Yeah, the only time I had any interaction with him, it was at the ACSM conference in Denver in 2017, because there was a really good symposium talk between Louise Burke, Trent Stellingworth, and him. Were the 3
speakers. Nice, sweet.
And to his credit, like, he brought up that whole situation and everything about how the one person massively improved. And I think sometimes that paper, I think it's a little undue flack, because if you read in the discussion, I think they do a pretty decent job of actually putting a lot of the results into context. With that, when a lot of people just like to harp on the one outlier, but they talk about that a fair bit throughout the paper. But yeah, I remember there was kind of a similar thing with some people kind of trying to talk to him afterwards, and he was just like, well, I'm going this way.
Yeah. Cool stuff, man. Well, thank you for all your time today. I really appreciate it. And where can people find more about you?
And so I am a assistant professor of exercise science at the University of South Alabama. I do technically have social media. The only one that I actually use occasionally is Twitter, mostly just using that to try to find papers. So if you go to my feed on that, it's usually just a bunch of retweeted papers, because essentially as I see people post papers, I just retweet them so that when I have time, I can go back and read them.
Yeah.
But the easiest way to get in contact with me is to email me. So it's just my name, Matthew Stratton, at southalabama.edu, if anyone wants to talk or anything. But if you try to add me on Instagram or something like that, I check that maybe twice a year. So if
you're not missing much.
If I don't respond to DMs, or I don't accept your follow request or something like that, I'm not ignoring you. I'm not trying to throw shade or anything. I just probably haven't been on in 4 or 5 months. So, but the best way is going to be email me, or just get in contact with me some way through the University of South Alabama.
And are you looking for any grad students or any help with any projects coming up?
Yeah, so we are going to be starting our doctoral program.
Oh, nice. Very cool. I heard some rumblings about it, but I didn't know what was going on or the details.
Yeah, so we have 2 students that are starting this fall. The first kind of big class is going to be starting next fall. And so if anyone's interested in like supplements or fasting, especially when it has to do with exercise and stuff like that, and looking for a doc program, you can reach out and let me know. We have a good master's program as well. So yeah, if anyone's looking to do some supplement and nutrition research, and especially in the Mobile area, so we're kind of right by the bay here in Alabama, which we got Florida in about 45 minutes one direction.
Hmm.
We got Mississippi in about 20 minutes the other direction. We got New Orleans 2 hours from here. We got
There you
Pensacola
go.
about 45 minutes. We got Atlanta about 4 hours. So pretty good, pretty nice location.
Yeah.
You got the beach like 15, 20 minutes from here. So
Oh, well, that's not bad.
exactly.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for all your time, and especially thank you for all your research over the years. I know I've read a lot of it, and it's been super helpful to see actual data on it, especially a lot of the other protocols. So thank you so much for all the work. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.